This should be a fun one, Nick. I really appreciate you coming on. A company called Think Onward, an innovative tech company based out of Austin, but Mick is just down the road from me here in Boulder, Colorado. So not too many of us in the patch out here, but always good when we get some time to connect with them. So Mick, the question that I have for you is a question that I ask everybody that comes on my podcast. Who are you, man? Who is Mik
Mm.
Isernia?
Hopefully, we're not going to go too philosophical on that, but let's see what we can do. Yeah, I have been in the industry, in oil and gas industry, for about 22 years. In another 15 before in technology in general, outside of oil and gas, things like automotive, aerospace, chemistry, pharmaceutical, stuff like that. So I ended up in oil and gas by coincidence in 2002, and I stayed. I got stuck with the bug of oil and gas. I actually enjoyed quite a bit. I spent the last 22 years always in pretty much subsurface exploration, not only, but vast majority has been the technical side and the geoscience side of the industry. Um, Background: I'm originally Italian. Left Italy now over 30 years ago, 32 or something. So I've been out for a long time in Colorado
Mm,
for 27. So pretty long time over here. Even though many people think that I live in Houston, I never lived in Houston, but I've been in Houston so much that people think I live there. So that's an
yeah.
interesting angle.
Sounds like me. Story of my life.
Exactly. So we always commute on United Airlines down to Houston, I guess. So yeah, that's it. Background: I studied computer science initially. I ended up doing an MBA at Stanford halfway in my career.
Cool.
This was a few years back. And I worked with a bunch of different companies, from large company to small companies. I started with people like HP and Microsoft and Nvidia, AWS, but also been involved with companies like Blue Air, and also been co-founder and investor in many startups. I still am invested in a variety of different things. I even invested in a company that did exploration directly. We drilled a couple of wells in Louisiana.
Hmm.
So I've been all over the map, if you want to see it that way.
Yeah, I mean, geographically and career wise. So let's go way back. So you were born in Italy, grew up in Italy. What was that like? I mean, not like you have something to compare it to since you didn't grow up over here, but what was growing up like in Italy?
Well, I was in an interesting situation. I grew up in Milan, right in the center of Milan. Milan is the capital, the economic capital of Italy. That's where all the business really is done. And yeah, I was quite exposed to everything you have around you without even realizing. From art to fashion to design, everything was like around me without me even realizing. I realized it more when I left what I had and what I grew up with. So, the US was kind of a dream. I went to Germany first, by the way. So I went to Germany
Okay.
5 years, and then after Germany, the US. And for me, travel has always been interesting. Learning new languages, new cultures, new way of living has always been very attractive. So I didn't feel any pain traveling, changing countries. Actually, always looking forward to it. And yeah, it's been very interesting for me in my career and my life to be exposed to multiple cultures.
Yeah, it's neat. So growing up, would you guys travel to various different other European countries? Because everything feels relatively close together
It
down there,
is.
right? I'm actually
It
looking at a
is.
business trip coming up to London, and I'm like, this is pretty easy. I could take like a 3 hour train to Amsterdam, a 2.5 hour train to Paris. Like you start hitting different countries really quickly. So did you do a lot of traveling as a kid?
Actually, not at all. I come from a family with very simple means, so we
Okay.
didn't have money to do any of that stuff. And my first travel, funny enough, I think I was 19, and I left and I went with I don't know many stops. I went to uh, Belgium, Saudi Arabia, Khartoum, Kigali, so Rwanda, and then Burundi. So I was a volunteer in Africa for a big project. So my first travel was actually going from Milan to a very remote location in Africa where I worked for a while on a third world development project. That was my first trip outside of Italy, unless you count going to Switzerland for skiing, but that's just 1 hour drive. That doesn't really count as a
Nice.
going abroad.
Nice. So you came over, so you lived in Africa for a little bit. Did you go to college in Italy?
Yeah, yeah. I did
Yeah,
computer science in Milan.
got it. And then Germany, you said for a little bit. Is that where you started your career?
I started in Milan for 3 years. I worked in Italy, and then my company was bought by HP, and then they needed somebody with my background, and I moved at European level to support customers at European level. Yeah, in Stuttgart at that time.
How many languages do you speak?
None completely. That's the right answer. So depending on where I am, depending how I feel and what I'm talking about, I can have conversation in a few languages and make stuff up in between. So whatever works, it
Nice.
depends. Depends.
So you start in Milan, you end up in Germany. You work with a company that gets acquired. Start working for HP, which I'm guessing even back then was pretty big. Had you
Yeah.
ever been to the US, or was your first time in the US when you moved here?
No. So when I started working for HP and even the previous company, I had several trips to the US. In fact, my first trip was to Colorado, interesting enough, for a
Nice.
training. And I remember I landed in Denver. At that time, Denver was a much smaller place. It was the old Stapleton Airport. And I know they lost my bag. So I ended up in Fort Collins without a bag. First time I got here. And I had some very interesting days that day because I actually got stopped by the police because I was going like 5 miles below above the speed limit. I came out of the car with my driver license, and the policeman pointed the gun at me and saying, "Go back to the car." That was my welcome to the US day. So it was an interesting, culture shock on some of these things, but that was a long time. Yeah.
Wait, what? So when you get pulled over in Italy, you get out of the car?
Yeah, people don't shoot you because of speeding stuff. You just go out and you talk to the police and you figure things out. You don't have to put your hands on the steering wheel and be careful. So I learned that pretty fast.
That's amazing. No, that I love that. So you made a few trips over here. You already knew you wanted to be in business, right? What prompted the move officially to the United States, and where did you go first? Did you move to Colorado, and what were you doing?
Yeah, so the offer that I got from HP was to move to the US, was to be kind of the person that will connect the experience with customers and in the field and the development of a new computer. So I was the person connecting the customer needs and the R&D team, so
Mm,
connecting the two sides so that when the product is actually launched, it's fully ready. All the software is ready, customer needs are already known up front. So it was like a complete solution program manager. That's what they called it at that time. Very interesting. Originally, that job was supposed to go to Boston. That's where we
mhm.
had a group. But by the time I moved, they had closed that group and they moved me to Colorado. That's why I ended up in Colorado in the first place. Pure
So there
coincidence.
was like no real plan to end up in Colorado. You're like, well, I guess I'm going to Boston. I'll stay in Boston. You
Exactly.
probably would have liked it there too. The North End has some pretty good Italian food.
Yeah,
So
yeah, exactly. I mean, by the way, I know that area quite well because I was there many times and I was pretty enamored of Boston and the New England area. But, Colorado was very different, of course, especially at that time. If you go back, 20, 30, whatever, 30 years ago, whatever it was, it's like very different compared to today. I mean,
extremely, yeah. I mean, I moved out here, from New England 20 years ago, sight unseen, and I'm still here. But the change is pretty stark. I think especially with Denver. Like Denver back then was still kind of a cow town. Like there was a
oh, yeah.
couple of like telecom companies and
Yeah.
maybe a little bit of a tech scene from like that early tech boom in the late 90s, early 2000s, but it was a cow town. And then it kind of transitioned to be a little bit more of like a pot town, right? Because there's the legalization of
Right.
marijuana
Yeah.
and you start getting influx of tourism. Then I feel like in the past maybe 10 years, it's actually become like what I would consider like a real city.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah. Definitely, definitely. I mean, even other parts of Colorado. Remember when I landed in 2002 and you arrived at Stapleton? I was going to Fort Collins. The highway was only a two-way lane highway. It
well,
was all pretty much grass fields all the way. There was nothing in between, and the sign was saying Cheyenne, Wyoming. It was not even
right.
saying Fort Collins, Colorado. So it's like a interesting how these evolved. Now there are some parts of that highway that are 4 or 5 lanes, and it's kind of yeah, big change.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Stanford a little bit earlier. When I was in San Francisco once, I was sitting at a wine bar, actually at Tony's Pizza, which is kind of a
Mm,
famous pizza place in San Francisco. Some of the
yeah,
best pizza that I've ever had in my life. Absolutely love it.
yeah.
And I was sitting at the bar there and talking to a guy who is actually in the Stanford Real Estate Hall of Fame.
Mhm.
And he was talking a little bit about Colorado. This is about 3 years ago, 2 years ago, and he was saying it's this is really the time for Colorado. He mentioned some of the same things that you said, where that corridor on I-25 from Fort Collins to Colorado Springs used to be just fields, right?
Yeah,
It was like all agriculture, all cows. Now it's almost like one continuous,
yeah,
like, developed area all the way from Fort Collins through Denver to Colorado
yeah,
Springs, and it's only going to keep going, right? People know now that this is a great
yeah,
area
yeah,
to be.
yeah, yeah. And it's a great place. I'm happy that I landed here. I had many chances to move to Houston or other places, but for my family, it made more sense for to be here, and then I traveled from here.
Yeah, yeah, and Boulder obviously is a beautiful place. So I'm jealous that you're there. I'm in Lafayette, which isn't bad, but Boulder obviously a super special place. So you're here. You knew you were going to work in tech, right? You end up in Colorado. You're at HP. Where did your career go from there? I know there were some stints at other really big companies and very prominent,
Yeah,
popular names. Where'd you go after HP?
yeah. I mean, the story is quite similar, at least for the first two. When I was in oil and gas in HP, we did a pretty good job for 3 to 5 years to grow that vertical. HP became kind of the darling for many of the vendors, from Schlumberger to Halliburton and many others. We did very well. The team was very excited. We called ourselves like a team of pirates, if you want. We were just taking no prisoner, figuring things out. It was really fun. And then, of course, new CEO comes in. He started to go through the spreadsheets, cuts, and they said, okay, no, vertical is not that important. So, okay, there he goes. So
Yeah,
my previous boss at that time moved to Microsoft, and he called me the next week, said, okay, let's do the same thing here again. So I did
nice.
about 3 years at Microsoft. We did the same, almost the same thing. I just changed the company name, but the people, the contact, the role was about the same. And then I did the same thing for NVIDIA. When NVIDIA was still not the NVIDIA that is today, NVIDIA at the
Oh
time
my
was still
God.
fighting. We were fighting to get GPUs into seismic processing or reservoir simulation or other places, right? So very different. Right now, everybody's killing each other to get an NVIDIA GPU. At that time, was a lot of real work to be done to convince people to replace a CPU with a GPU. Really good fun with that team as well. We stay pretty good friends with that. And then eventually I got the call to help a European startup open the US office. And, I joined with a few other people, and that's what we did. That what became eventually became Blue Air, was a merge of four companies. We orchestrated kind of reverse merge kind of thing. So we finded four companies that together would make sense. We found investment from Shell Ventures, Energy Ventures, and we were able to grow when other people were going out of business. It was actually quite an interesting experience from that perspective. And
Yeah,
then after that, Amazon was building their vertical for energy. So I did enough with Blue Air. So I joined AWS for 3 years. When they built the team, they went from 10 people to 300, and good experience there as well. And then what is my current company now was something that came out of left field and sounded extremely interesting. I said, why not?
yeah. It's the smallest company you've worked for, it sounds like, at least to this point in your career. Talk a little bit about what it's like. I mean, I think I remember you telling me even at one point, like when you were at Microsoft, like you actually had meetings with Steve Ballmer, right? Like you were dealing with
Yeah,
some of the senior executives there.
we have some interesting situation there. I remember, again, historical stuff. Now, CERAWeek is a big deal, right? It used to be always a
Yeah,
big deal, but at that time, CERAWeek was very much a geopolitical gig. It was all ministers and CEOs were talking about at high level. There was almost no tech. In fact, there was no tech whatsoever. I remember we had a conversation with the people organizing CERAWeek. They were looking for sponsors, and I was at HP at that time. And I said, guys, you want to be sponsored, but there is no technical. So it doesn't make a lot of sense for companies like us to invest. And I started to have the idea you should have a CEO of a technology company to speak to your audience, to give
sure.
them an understanding of how technology is going to change. And the guy actually opened up to it. And so I tried to go first to my CEO at the time. People may remember Carly Fiorina. There was the CEO of HP at the time, pretty controversial person. She was not available, so I was unable to get her to be the keynote at CERAWeek. So I talked to my friend at Microsoft at the time. We were partners. I said, hey, could we get somebody? So we were able to get Steve Ballmer to be the first technical CEO
Amazing.
to be the keynote at Sarah. And so that was interesting. Then we did the same thing when I was at NVIDIA. We were able to get the CEO of NVIDIA to be the keynote as well. And if you look at what happens today, Sarah Week has two sides. There is the Sarah Week that is a political, and there is the Agora that is very much technology driven. It's growing a lot. This came all from that initial conversation about sponsoring Sarah Week. I mean, in 2003 or four, something like that.
Oh, that's really cool, right? I mean, you to me, some of these names that you're mentioning are like rock stars, right? These are like celebrities, right? They're people that own sports teams. And for you, it's like, hey, we need a keynote speaker for this event, and then it launches into something else. So you've had your fingerprints in some pretty cool stuff in oil and gas. I want to touch on AWS a little bit too, because I remember when you went over there and joined, and the growth was just it was completely insane at that time, and really the most powerful company in the world. I feel like Amazon as a whole. What was it like?
Amazon more than AWS. Amazon
So
for
so
us more than AWS.
so you would say AWS is a completely different business than Amazon? Like, is that how you'd look at it?
Yeah, if you think about the way AWS grew, it became pretty much the IT organization for Amazon IT. And then they developed enough, IP and innovation. They said, other people will need the same thing. And they came up with this cloud idea. And they were, I think, lucky enough that their number two company at that time was, Microsoft was, the key tech company. They didn't pay attention too much of this cloud thing for a while.
Yeah.
So Amazon got about 6, 7 years of run rate or running without anybody competing with them. So that gave them a fantastic advantage, right? And then there is some other things that Amazon did in terms of DNA, how they think about innovation. That was quite interesting. Um, Now, of course, it's a huge company now. It's not the same, super agile company that it was when they started, but it's still trying to find a way forward and innovating all the time. It's quite interesting. Yeah.
Did you get to meet Andy Jassy or Jeff Bezos?
No, 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 didn't get to those levels. No, I was only there
Who's
3 years, and we were just working with our own little energy team, trying to get on the map for energy companies. So didn't have that level of exposure, at least not me.
I feel like you guys successfully did that though. It was sort of like, all right, people are using AWS, and then there's this massive explosion. I think a lot of it happened during COVID too, where AWS is now sort of everywhere, right? And you've got this
Yeah,
OSDU and all this other stuff. So you're at big companies, right? Besides Blueware, right? Obviously, a little bit of a smaller kind of roll up gig,
yeah.
bringing a European company over here. So you've worked at really big companies, and then you end up at Think Onward. So talk a little bit about what you're doing today with Think Onward. Like, what drew you to the company? What are some of the differences in working for a smaller company versus some of these behemoth tech companies?
So Onward is an interesting hybrid, right? Because the company it is 70 plus people, so not huge, not a super startup, but it's something in between. But it's a company that is owned by Shell. So
Mm,
that's another. It's an interesting mix, right? So you have a big, mothership that has decided to create this company for good reason. We'll talk maybe in a second about what they did. But we have kind of a two souls. We are a startup. We are also connected to a big company, and because we are fully owned by Shell, we have to be quite a bit in compliance with everything that is Shell, from
hmm
legal and anti-corruption and anti-trade, all the things that a big oil company worries about because we're 100% owned, we have to be aware about all of those and be cognizant of the requirements. So it's a bit of a mix, and that's why it's interesting as well.
So the how did Think Onward get born then? Was
Yeah.
Shell like, we have a whole bunch of projects that we want to work on, and you've got this skilled technology group, and all of a sudden you guys are building stuff, and you're like, hey, wait a second, we have a company here. Like, was that the genesis of Onward?
No, so as some of the executive on the exploration side of Shell, they started to they're very innovative. They look at the industry and what's happening as far as innovation and technology out there, and they started to have the feeling that the way a traditional IOC works with pretty much a closed R&D thinking, our own
Yep.
people, our own research. By the way, some of these companies have massive research teams, right? That we're not talking small effort, but they say, look, there is so much innovation happening outside that if we don't think about a new model, we're going to miss a lot. So the initial
Sure.
idea was very much at these levels. How can we tap into the more collective brain of scientists around the world to augment our internal brains? That was the kind of the spark, if you want, of the idea. So they worked with Boston Consulting for a year and a half to incubate this
Mhm.
idea. This became the first name of the company was Studio X.
Oh yeah.
Studio X,
Right.
yeah. was only 5 people, 5 people with with this mission in mind to say, can we create a crowd innovation model that will bring in the best of brains out there in the world and make it available initially to Shell only. The initial idea was just to extend Shell. So for 3 or 4 years, this company was only serving Shell, and with this model. So they started to create this network of open innovation,
Hmm.
both in data science and geoscience. They also created a small accelerator or incubator to start investing in early stage companies that could be relevant for climate tech and energy, and started growing from there. So eventually, there was also a moment where Google had a pretty nice innovative team focusing on energy, but they decided that energy was not, you know, strategic anymore. Specifically, oil and gas was not, fashionable anymore. But there was a fantastic team in Austin, and we picked up some of the best people from that group as well. So we now have our own R&D as well. So now the company has multiple pieces, right? There is the incubator. We have this crowdsourcing community. There's about 6,000 people worldwide and growing. And we
Nice.
have our own R&D. So it's hard sometimes to explain what we are to people because we have these multiple souls, but it's still a pretty interesting bet. And again, about 6 months ago, Shell said, okay, you guys delivered enough value to Shell. Why don't you open up to the rest of the industry and see if other companies would be open to leverage this kind of model.
Yeah. I mean, makes perfect sense to me. And from a technology perspective, there's some forward thinking in terms of sustainability, but also artificial intelligence, right?
A lot of it is AI, and the technology-wise foundation is mostly AI with a real mix of geoscience, earth science skills. So if you think about this unique differences, we have people that deeply understand geoscience and earth science with
Yep.
this kind of innovative, flexible model. So we have a pretty unique way to say we can bring innovation in. We understand how to apply to geoscience and earth science and climate tech, and we now are finding ways to turn this into IP and value that operators can sign up for.
So when I think of AI, right, at least at a minimum, I think about like OpenAI, ChatGPT, right, conversational, asking questions on a personal level. But when I think
Mhm,
about it from an oil and gas standpoint, it's about asking questions of data, right?
mhm.
So
Yeah.
I'm curious to kind of learn a little bit more, and have had some exposure, of course, to your organization. Really impressed what Onward is doing. But like, how do oil and gas companies want to interact with their data, leveraging AI? Right, because as you know, oil and gas has just tons and tons of data, whether it's from SCADA systems, whether it's from drilling and subsurface and internal systems like accounting or
Mhm.
production, and then public data sets as well. Like, how do companies rationalize how they leverage AI for this data? Like, how does this work?
Right. So it's an interesting, and everybody's not everybody's the same. Obviously, there are different companies with different personalities. Uh, there are some very tangible areas where people have been trying to apply AI, or even just call it analytics plus AI plus LLM now.
Yeah.
One is operations. I mean, that's the one that has always been the one that has the biggest opportunity for savings, because it's typically people heavy kind of operations. So
Yep.
every time you have people involved and people have to run around with a truck to check an oil field or inside a refinery or a pipeline, there is a lot that can be saved, a lot that can be predicted. Prediction is really the key in that space, right? Can you predict, can you avoid downtime and so on? That has
Yep.
been going on for a while. My impression in that space, but in other spaces, is that unfortunately, in the energy industry in particular, it is very difficult to innovate. And
Hmm.
the difficulty is because it's very hard for an oil company to adopt a new ISV, a new solution.
Yep.
There are so many barriers to go from your true, tested and true vendor that you had for 30 years to
Yep.
bring in a new innovative company. Even if you like what they have, sometimes you cannot even give them data. You cannot give them real data to test and demonstrate. So there are some
That's right.
very basic things. Then you pass that point, and then IT is going to block you for a year, or legal, or procurement. So I saw with my own skin, we brought in some innovative AI with Blue Air for exploration in some companies. From the day we signed the contract to the day they deployed was 3 years.
Wow.
So in 3 years, in this day and age, in 3 years, people didn't even know what OpenAI was 3 years
Right.
ago. People
Right.
had no idea how to. So think about the speed of innovation out there and how limiting are some of the internal processes, right? So the aspiration of many people in the companies are to use AI in many ways, but how do you go from that to deploy, to turning into real money? That I think is one of the biggest challenges, and we're trying to address that ourselves in onward. So, for example, we can be a lot more flexible in adopting new technology compared to maybe even Shell themselves. And if you combine these people that we have in the crowdsourcing community and
Yeah.
experts with this technology, and we can show it in a project, demonstrate how much value you can extract from an oil company, that will give them a way to test the impact of this in modern technology onto a real use case scenario versus aspiring to test something that sometimes is the barrier they face.
Yeah. I, I like the way that you walked through that, and it makes a ton of sense. Like, I think the approach that's going to win out ultimately in oil and gas will be integrated data sets plus AI LLM chatbot. I bet we'll see a lot of vendors who have a product create some sort of wrapper on top of it where you can ask questions just of their data. But where the real value comes in is where you have lots of different data sets feeding in and being able to ask questions of it, right? And I think that that's the direction that you guys are going. Talk about a little bit about like training some of these models. Like, how long does it take to train an AI model to be able to work and interact with oil and gas data? Does it require thousands of different documents and data points? Is it millions? Is it billions? Like, this is something that I'm really curious about, and as it relates to oil and gas specifically.
I think it's quite different when people think about this. If you think like an open AI approach, where there is a something crawling the world, the internet, and come
Right.
up with this universal thing, right? So the opportunity and the challenge in oil and gas is to focus on specific domain data. So you pick a well report or drilling report or something else. There is a pretty decent corpus of documentation for each oil company in that stuff. Thousands of documents, may not be millions, but in the thousand, maybe 10,000, depending how long the company has been around. And if you focus on a specific domain and you have already a platform that can ingest and make sense of the taxonomy, the language, and the science itself, you don't need millions of documents. You can
Okay.
start to get some significant value with a few hundreds, and of course, you can keep growing, right? But you're starting with the approach of saying, I'm not trying to boil the ocean. I'm trying to solve a specific use case. Okay, so I think that's when you make it not only faster to deliver, but also tangible to a specific, budget holder, manager, team, whatever, right?
Yeah. And it reminds me a little bit of if we go back 10, 12 years ago when companies started to think in terms of business intelligence, right? So that was kind of a
Mhm.
hot term back then. So you build some sort of data warehouse and then you slap some sort of analytics on top of it, whether it be Spotfire or Tableau or something like that. And it's overwhelming, right? What you have to do is pick something specific that one part of an organization will gain benefit from. And one of the stories that I like to come back to, and I'll never forget this. This is a Dallas-based oil and gas company, and I was talking to the VP of operations, and I showed him a dashboard that incorporated data from their financial system, so like an SAP, and from their
Mhm.
well data system, their drilling and completions, and their real time production, and their forecasting system, and then their expense, their invoices. Pull all this data together and analyze on a well by well basis the profitability of a well over a given period of time. And I remember him asking, what does this cost? I said, this is $50,000 for a year, and then there's an implementation cost. And I think he meant to put me on mute, but he didn't. And what he said and leaned over to somebody on his team, he goes, 50 grand? Because that's one well, right? If I
Yeah,
can optimize one well because of this
yeah,
data that I have here, then it makes sense. And it made me, it simplified it for me so much, right? It has to be a logical use case that the business can digest. But I see companies all the time and saw it back then trying to boil the ocean, right?
yeah,
So I think it's really about where do you start, right? What is the logical use case that you start with? Because AI is going to be everywhere, right?
yeah,
How do we manage
exactly.
that AI?
Absolutely. Pick the use cases, make that work. Try to do it with the platform thinking so you don't reinvent the wheel every time. So you don't do this project, the next one is different and different, different. So you need to find the balance between try to find a platform that is generic enough, but then apply to a specific use case. Prove that, rinse and repeat, and do more like that. So that's, I think, is the best way to do it for everybody involved. So even from
Yeah.
our side, you don't want to promise the nirvana. Okay, hey, this is solves all your problem. And some companies do that. They pretend to have everything that is perfect. We can solve every problem. I mean, I don't feel very comfortable with that. I think it's better to walk before you run, demonstrate value, and then continue.
Incremental wins. But on
Yeah,
the flip side, you see these, and maybe they're engineers, or maybe they're in operations, and they start hearing in the news about what AI is doing, and then
yeah.
they go to their teams and say, hey, we want to use AI for everything, right? So then the thought process becomes ingrained that it needs to be this big grandiose thing. What I'm hearing you say is it doesn't need to be that, right? Pick
No,
something, pick some documents, pick some set of data where you can get value from it that eliminates some of the human manual element, and let the computers do the work.
and one thing that I learned again in a couple of previous companies was the fact that ultimately, many projects, many processes, a human being has to sign off on something.
Right. Right.
So there's no way around that. Okay, we're not yet at the point where a plant is completely without humans and can be run by itself. There's a long way to go, I think. So there is an interesting balance between giving a tool that can solve a problem using AI, but still giving the respecting the authority and the involvement of the human so he can make the right assessment and feel comfortable with that tool. So that balance between completely unmanned AI and understanding the responsibility of the people that have to sign off, it's an interesting balance, pretty critical.
Yeah. Good point. Right? We're not ready to fully transition to the machines taking over, nor should we,
Yeah,
especially for a safety centric industry like oil and gas.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Mick, I want to transition a little bit and ask some kind of higher level questions. So, you've been in oil and gas. You're a grizzled veteran at this point, right? You've been doing this for over 20 years, and you've seen technology evolve quite a bit. Where do you see it going over the next 3, 5, 10 years? Do you see an increased emphasis on ESG, sustainability, hydrogen or geothermal type drilling, and from a technology perspective, do you see more of a reliance on AI? Like, is part of why you took this job because you see this being an extremely fast growing area? You've seen where tech has come from. You've seen where the industry's come from. Where do you see it going?
Yeah, so different areas. So technologies is now percolating across the industry everywhere, right? I think the biggest issue that I still see is the internal processes that are red taping and blocking the adoption of technology. So
Yeah.
people see it, want it, but some of the internal process doesn't matter if it's procurement or legal or IT or whatever, it's an issue. The second thing is the other barrier is how do you get a veteran that is an expert on a certain application to be willing and to have the time to learn something new, right?
Yeah.
The typical, the cartoon with the guy trying to sell the machine gun to the guy who says, I have no time, I'm going to keep using arrows. So it's a bit that situation. So how are companies are going to adapt and modify those processes so that they can actually adopt technology before the technology is obsolete? Because right now, the time to adopt is the time of obsolescence for technology in high tech. So it's actually pretty crazy. It's got to the point that the 3 years that it takes to deploy makes what you're deploying obsolete. So you really have to think that completely differently. And I think the question about hydrocarbons, geothermal, carbon capture, hydrogen, all of these would play. Some of them would be, very few of them would be as profitable as hydrocarbons.
You're
Okay.
right.
So the biggest challenge is now you're not going to have the same level of margins and profitability in some different areas of energy. ESG is an example, right? Carbon capture is an example. You have to do it. There are mandates and obligation, but can you actually be profitable with that? So I think here technology is going to be even more important. Even this crowdsourcing approach that we have could be even more important because can you actually afford to have $300,000 a year salary people in a certain number in a business that is not as profitable as hydrocarbon is? So technology is going to be a critical function into the efficiency and the profitability of the companies coming forward.
Yeah, and I think you combine that with, generally speaking, less younger people getting into the industry, right?
Right.
I mean, we've seen that shift, and I think we had, geez, a while ago, some Texas A&M professors on this podcast talking about how, man, there are just a lot less students going through the petroleum engineering program
Yeah.
and putting those people out in the industry. So there will be a gap there for sure that technology will need to fill. I want to hit you with some rapid fire questions because I always like doing this with my guests. Number one, Mick, what is your favorite city to travel to in the world?
I just came back from Paris. I think Paris is really on the top of the list in terms of an amazing place where you can have art, culture, food, walk around, beauty. I think Paris is fantastic. I like London. I'm not going to mention the Italian cities because it's like home, so I'm gonna skip those.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
for me, London and Paris in Europe are extremely nice. Also because I know them quite well. I like Sydney quite a bit. I enjoyed Shanghai. So there are a few places that are really fine. Singapore is amazing. There is not a single place. There are many places that I've been around in my career that are very nice and different. Even Tokyo, very super interesting in a very diverse, extremely diverse environment in terms of what you see, what you taste, the products, everything that is out there is so different that is amazing from that perspective.
And are most of these places you've been to for business, and then you kind of turned it into some personal trip as well, or like because obviously you've done a lot of international business if that's the case.
Yeah, yeah. I've been in so many places around the world, and I always try to find a little bit of time to also see, the cities. Some places I went back, of course, personally. Another place that I like a lot is Rio. Rio is fantastic as well. So there are many different places. I love to travel. And I love to visit cities. So I have a long list, not a short one.
But you didn't mention any in the US. What's your favorite city to travel to in the US?
Interesting. Um, I tell you something controversial. I like nature in the US. I'm not a
Yeah,
fan of cities. I think the nature in the US is amazing and there is some of the most beautiful things, uh, not just in the West in particular, but not just the West. I like the Northwest. In North America,
me
from a,
too.
from a, from a natural standpoint, is amazing. Cities, they are interesting ones, but if you compare that to some of the European or Asian cities, I think it's not the same level. It's just my personal impression.
Do you think that's because the cities that you're talking about internationally are so much older and they have more just established culture and history to it? Because I could see that being part of the reason, but I'm wondering why these
Well,
international cities strike you differently.
so that would be true for a Paris or a London. But if you compare to Singapore, Singapore, if you think about it, is a fairly new state concept, relatively speaking, in history. So it's not older than New York or other
Yeah,
old, let's say, old American cities. But I think the way they build that city, for example, it's quite innovative, both in terms of green space, public transportation, huge issue in the U.S. Right?
yeah.
Having a place that you can easily move around, city to city, inside the city, walk around safely, and so on. That makes a big difference, I think, in the way you feel about a place.
Right. Like, you can't be in Los Angeles or Houston or Dallas without a car. It's just
Yeah,
the reality of it. Like,
US, I think, has the opposite advantage. The medium small cities sometimes are really nice because you add that kind of feeling of a local walking around and kind of a community feeling. Uh, that especially when they have universities, US is very good at creating
yeah.
big university centers. So that combination, I think, is very very US specific. I think that I really enjoy.
Yeah, so you're happy you ended up in Boulder, it sounds like,
Yeah.
which is the best of kind of all those worlds because you got great food. So food, right? I want to
Mm.
ask you this. Give me some of your favorite restaurants. First in maybe some of the oil cities in the US, but also just in the world. What are some of your favorite restaurants?
I don't keep memory of the restaurant specifically. I can tell you that if I have to choose where to go, I tend to go sushi or Asian food first. Just my preference, mainly because I cook myself, so I don't really need to go pay for an Italian restaurant myself. So I feel kind of almost cheated sometimes when I do that. So, but yeah, I don't have a specific list of restaurants. If I have them saved when I go to a city, I know where to go, but I
Yeah.
cannot give you a specific address.
So what you do you make your own pizza and pasta and all that stuff at home?
We cook quite a bit, especially with friends. We do pretty much anything you can get in a restaurant, just at home or with friends. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, so I'm sure you got a nice, wood fired oven or something like that, right? Got to have it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, Sports teams. Do you care about American sports? Like, what is this like for an Italian? You grow up over there, and you come over here. Everybody's into football, right? And we got
Yeah.
basketball, hockey. These are sports that I guess basketball and soccer they play over there. But do you care about U.S. sports at all?
No. In fact, I don't even care about European sports anymore. So I'll tell you a little bit of story. So my apartment in Milan was in front of the main stadium. Okay. So we had 3 times a week, there was somebody playing.
Yeah,
You're invaded by, teams and people screaming and noise and so on. So you end up not being a fan just because it's intrusive into your life anyway. But I used to follow, soccer, tennis, skiing, Formula One, all that stuff when I was in Europe. When I got over here, I never felt, interested in. And I have some funny stories. I mean, I think I tell you one that could be interesting. We had sponsorship for the Astros in Houston when I was in HP, I think, yeah. And
yeah.
so I went to one of the baseball a baseball game, and I was there paying attention. And at a certain point, I'm saying, I really need to go to the restroom. So just go. And I said, when is the break? There is no break. You just go whenever you want. Nobody cares. Everybody's just there socializing, drinking, talking. I was waiting for, when is a break, kind of stuff. So it was like completely, alien to how it works. So pretty funny.
Like, there's no halftime. They just keep going back on the field, and somebody gets in the
Exactly.
batter's box.
Exactly. I would say, when is this over? I mean, anyway.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, baseball's a little bit different now with the pitch clock, but that's one of the things I have historically liked about baseball is there is no time. So my wife would ask me like, "Hey, you're at the baseball game. What time does it end?" I'm like,
Yeah, you
"I
don't
don't
know.
know."
Yeah,
She's like, "Well,
exactly.
can you give me like a ballpark?" I'm like, "I mean, it could be done in 30 minutes. It might be playing tomorrow. I don't know. It could be the
Yeah,
longest game of all time. I have no idea, right?"
exactly.
But
Yeah,
with the
exactly.
clock, they've condensed it a little bit. I think because we're all in this ADD, Twitter generation where we can only consume so much information at once. Um, so, Mick, I'm enjoying hearing your perspective both on technology, some of your history, and the international slant that you've taken on business. Final question I have for you, more of a reflective one. Like, what advice would you give to your younger self? So you've got 21-year-old Mick looking to get out of school. You're ready to take over the world. You want to work in business, travel internationally, do all these things. Like, what advice would you have for your younger self back then?
Hmm. I was very green when I got into my. I don't know how everybody else that is listens in, but I had really not much of a clue. So I started working, just get a job, figuring it out.
Just
I
hustle.
What helped me was interesting. I ended up being one of the few people left that had a certain technical knowledge with a lot of customers around Europe that were screaming for help to
Mhm.
the point they were almost suing HP at that time because of breach of contract. So I ended up for 5 years only dealing with really pissed off customers with real problems. Okay. So I learned so much. It was like a battlefield. So every customer was like ready to strangle somebody. And I was that bone thrown to the dog, right? So I learned so much in those 5 years that was like amazing. So that was my one thing. One thing that I learned from that experience was interesting. Everybody always tries to go after the new stuff, right? Always after
Yeah.
the new, the new, the new. But in that case, I was actually successful because I was the only person that was able to understand the old. And technology in companies lasts forever, as we discussed before. So
Yeah.
there are still people today that have to program and fix COBOL, programs
Sure.
or Fortran or stuff like that. So, and those people are becoming extremely valuable. So sometimes
Yeah.
you may have a contrarian thinking about, I'm actually going to stick with this old thing because I'm going to be the only one left on the planet. But it was just a coincidence in my case. In terms of learning, I wish I would have learned faster to understand how business really works versus being on the technology angle. So I would have done that earlier, would have been useful. Willing to take more risk and changing either job or company earlier. My first half of my career, I stayed with one company for half of my life. So I didn't change. I changed jobs inside the company, but was not even thinking about, opening up. So eventually, I understood that there is a lot of opportunity out there, and you can apply yourself to different companies. You learn to that transition. So I would encourage people to be open, not necessarily to leave every 5 minutes, but keep their ears open.
There's a lot there that resonates with me too. And I think one of the things that you said that stood out is um, instead of just like learning the technology, actually learning the business. And I
Yeah,
think for me coming in on the sales side, it was if you're going to have any intelligent conversation with somebody, especially if you're doing lead generation and you only get people's limited attention, you really need to
yeah,
understand the tech. So the first few years of my career, I never really learned about business. I just learned about technology, which I think helped over time because I was able to understand business eventually. But I remember working at a company. I was based actually in Boulder. And I was just, I was 25 years old and I really wanted to learn the technology and not have to bring in a sales engineer every single time I needed even just to have a discovery conversation. And then the company raised like $8 million in a Series A. I had no idea what that meant. None. Like I knew that $8 million was probably cool and it probably meant that I didn't have to worry about losing my job or my check clearing, but I didn't understand what that meant. Maybe it
yeah.
meant we could put more features into the technology, is what I thought, because I was hearing people ask for new features. But it really I should have asked more questions and started to learn more about the business side and not just the tech. So that resonates with me big time. Mick,
That's a big,
um,
it's a big challenge for startups, as you know, right? So many people come with a fantastic new tool and they cannot sell because a company with a much low tech product that has been there forever, they know how to talk to the right people and they keep selling forever, even though their product may be completely inferior. But so that's a big disadvantage of startups.
yeah, yeah, no, agreed. And I personally like to stay in that part of the ecosystem.
Mhm.
Final question. Well, I guess two more questions, but curious from you've had a sales background, you've had a technical background, big companies, small companies, entrepreneurial, international, domestic. Do from a kind of a sales or business perspective, do you subscribe to a certain methodology? Like, do you view yourself as more consultative in sales approach? Like how do you go about doing business in a complex enterprise business environment?
Yeah, my background, the way I evolved, I guess, or grew up, is that I'm more of a problem solver. So I don't, I would not fit very well with a company that has a predefined block of product that is completely
Yeah,
rigid, and you're just trying to sell door to door kind of stuff and scale. That is not what I enjoy. I enjoy solving problems, and typically I gravitate towards companies that have innovative technology or innovative approach to solve problems. And so eventually you end up with a sale, but the sale is simply a consequence of helping a customer solving a problem. So
yeah.
that's really the way I think of myself. It's more of a business development, lending into a sales versus a pure sales role.
I love that. Right. It's identify the pain, align a solution to that pain versus pushing a product on somebody, which I
Yeah.
think explains a lot about where you're at in your career. Mick, thank you so much. Where can people find your company? Where can they find you? Like websites, things like that.
Yeah. So the we go by Onward, but the website is thinkonward.com. And if you just put Mick in front with an at, you'll find me. Mick at thinkonward.com. That's how to find me. And then the website, you'll find it at thinkonward.com.
There's not a ton of Mix MIKs out there, at least in my ecosystem, so you're not hard to find. But Mik Isernia over at Onward, thank you so much. I think we're going to see this company do a lot in the next few years, and your journey and career continue to evolve. So thank you for coming on today.